The dog didn't bark. It lunged. A blur of dust and muscle, the camp hound leapt from the barrack steps with a snarl. The Japanese woman froze, her hands lifted, instinctive and trembling, expecting teeth. Around her, the American cowboys, military guards posted in the dusty Colorado camp, reached for their rifles. But what happened next didn't involve gunfire. Instead, the snarling beast dropped at her feet, whining. Rolling to its side, tail thumping, it pawed the hem of her uniform like an old friend had come home. The woman blinked. Her breath caught. She'd seen dogs used for terror. She'd heard their howls in Manila as they tore into wounded men. But this was different. The dog whimpered again, then nudged its head into her palm. A cowboy laughed. Another muttered, "Well, I'll be damned." And the spell broke. In a camp defined by suspicion and silence, something else had arrived with 4 legs and muddy paws, the first flicker of connection. The woman didn't move. Dust swirled around her boots as the dog pressed its nose into her palm, its breath hot and erratic. For a second, the entire world seemed to tilt. The buzz of flies, the creak of boots, even the dry wind all fell still. The guards who had been chatting near the gate had gone silent. One of them, a tall man in a cavalry hat with a rifle slung casually across his back, muttered something under his breath. Another, younger, with sunburnt cheeks and a sweat-ringed collar, chuckled nervously. No one reached for the dog. No one spoke to her. The POWs behind her, all women in worn khaki and canvas shoes, watched with wide, unreadable eyes. Somewhere near the mess hall, a harmonica played a note and stopped. The hound whimpered again, and the woman slowly, very slowly, knelt on the hard-packed earth and scratched behind its ear. It leaned into her touch. They called it Buck. A mutt born of ranch strays and border collie blood, Buck belonged to no one and everyone. He had arrived at the Colorado camp before the prisoners, before the new barbed wire fencing, and even before the guards. The men said he had once herded cattle, once chased coyotes, and once bitten a drunk corporal for stepping on his tail. No one could prove it, but the story stuck. He was territorial, ornery, and loyal to no one, except maybe the cook who slipped him bacon ends. But until that moment, Buck had never willingly touched a prisoner. He barked at them, circled them, sometimes growled low in his throat as they marched from barracks to mess. But now here he was, belly up in front of a Japanese woman barely old enough to be called anything but a girl, wagging his tail like they were childhood companions. She didn't understand. Not the dog, not the men, not the land. The dust here didn't stick like it did in the Philippines. It was lighter, finer, as if even the ground in America was less burdened. The sun above was dry and huge, beating down on her capless head with a strange kind of gentleness. No jungle humidity, no buzzing mosquitoes, just open air and open sky. The train that had brought her and the others to this strange place had rattled across 1,000 miles of ruin and silence. She had expected punishment, perhaps even death. Her orders, back when they still mattered, had been clear. To surrender was to disappear. To be captured was to become nothing. Instead, she stood in the middle of a ranch that had been turned into a POW camp, its fence line stretching along the foothills like a forgotten thought. The barracks were wooden and clean. The guard towers looked more like hunting blinds than watchposts. The men who watched over them wore cowboy boots and hats instead of jackboots. Their uniforms were wrinkled, their rifles dusty, and their eyes. Those were the hardest part. Not cold, not cruel, just curious. They looked at her now, not with anger, but with a kind of open surprise. The hound rolled onto its feet and shook, dust flying from its coat like ash. Then it trotted off toward the stables, as if nothing strange had happened at all. The silence lingered a beat longer before one of the guards broke it. "Well," he said, tipping his hat back, "reckon she passed the test?" The others laughed, softly, uneasily, but didn't disagree. The woman didn't respond. She had no idea what he meant. The test, the dog, the laughter. She only knew that the moment had passed and something in it had shifted. The camp no longer felt like a place where she would be broken. It felt like something else, a stage, a puzzle, a waiting game. Later, as she sat in the processing shed, her name taken down by a clerk with a thick Southern accent, she glanced out the window and saw the Hound again, lying in the shade beside the barrack steps. Watching, waiting. She looked away quickly, unsure of what any of it meant. The Americans gave her a number, a cot, a ration card, a uniform that didn't quite fit. But it was the dog she thought of as night fell. Its eyes, its choice. Why her? She didn't know it yet, but the question would return in many forms. As would the dog. And the look on the faces of the men, stunned not by threat or defiance, but by something far more dangerous to the myths they carried, affection. She had crossed half a world expecting to meet devils. Instead, she met a dog who laid down at her feet. In the darkness of the barracks that night, she could not sleep. The cot was too clean, the air too quiet. Her body, trained to expect violence in new surroundings, lay stiff beneath the blanket. She stared at the ceiling beams until her eyes burned. Somewhere outside, a harmonica trailed off mid-song. Then silence again, but in her mind the dog's warmth lingered. The surprising softness of its belly, the way its ears had twitched at her breath, how it had chosen her in front of everyone. That was the part she could not let go of. Chosen. Her fingers curled around the edge of the blanket. She had not been chosen in months. Not for safety, not for kindness, not even for punishment. In the final weeks before surrender, she'd watched men and women picked for duty, for death, for abandonment. There had been no explanations, only whispers. She closed her eyes and the images returned. The jungle hospital had no walls, only canvas and the stench of rot. Blood pooled under stretchers, flies nested in wounds. She remembered binding shattered limbs with banana leaves, using cigarette ash to disinfect cuts, grinding pills into powder and stretching them across dozens of mouths. She remembered one soldier who begged her for morphine as his leg blackened. There was none. She'd offered him her hand to bite down on. His eyes had gone wild before he passed. Later, the orderlies stripped him for parts, boots, belt, his pocket knife. "No waste," her commanding officer had said. She'd seen dogs, too, not like Buck. These were military animals, sharp black silhouettes against firelight, taught to track, chase, and tear. She had heard stories, true or embellished, of prisoners fed to them in Manila. Teeth as tools, fur stained with blood. She had never touched one. And then Buck rolled over in the dirt and asked to be petted. The dissonance cracked something inside her. At morning call, she stood in line outside the mess hall, eyes down, breath steady. The air was cool, the prairie sky wide and impossibly blue. When a guard passed by with a canteen, pausing to offer water, she flinched, expecting a trick. He didn't speak, just held it out like it was nothing. She hesitated, then took it. The metal was cold in her hand, the water sweeter than anything she'd tasted in weeks. She handed it back without looking up, but out of the corner of her eye she saw him nod, once, slowly, and walk on. It was such a small gesture, a nod, a sip, but it shook her. What game were they playing here? No one had barked orders, no one had slapped her for hesitating. The other women beside her, nurses, clerks, support staff, all moved with the same brittle tension. Each one had arrived armored in shame, ready for degradation. Yet the Americans didn't leer, didn't laugh. They said little, but when they did speak, their words were not cruel. Sometimes they joked. At lunch, the same soldier who had offered the canteen passed her again. She glanced up. Their eyes met, and in his she saw something she couldn't translate. Not sympathy, not smugness, just recognition, as if he knew the war inside her was not over. That night she lay awake again. Buck didn't come, but she found herself staring at the door, waiting, wanting, not for safety, but for confirmation that what she had felt in that moment, the cold canteen, the warm nod, was real. Because if it was, then everything she had been taught about the enemy, about honor, about surrender, might be a lie, and that lie, she feared, might be more dangerous than any rifle. The next morning she woke to it, a smell, rich, greasy, alive. It slid through the cracks in the wooden barracks like a ghost from another world, thick with fat, sharp with salt, and utterly impossible. Bacon. She sat up slowly, the wool blanket falling from her shoulders. Around her, the other women stirred in their bunks. Some turned their heads toward the window, nostrils flaring, eyes still fogged with sleep. One woman whispered, "It can't be," but no one answered. She stepped onto the floorboards, cold beneath her bare feet, and opened the door. The air hit her, dry, golden, and heavy with the scent of frying meat. She froze on the threshold. Across the yard, smoke curled from the kitchen chimneys. American guards moved casually, their rifles slung, their movements unhurried. She could hear voices, low, indifferent, almost bored, and the occasional hiss of fat hitting a hot pan. Then, without sound or warning, the dog appeared again. Buck trotted up the path between the barracks, tail swishing lazily, tongue lolling from his mouth. He made no sound as he approached her, no bark, no growl, just the quiet rhythm of his paws on dirt. He sat down beside her and leaned against her leg like he belonged there. She didn't know why, but she didn't move. Her fingers found his fur, and he sighed, a sound of total ease. The bell rang for breakfast. There was no shouting, no boots slamming against walls, no barked orders or yanked doors, just the sound of the bell, a soft clatter of trays, and the murmur of a new day beginning. The women lined up, uncertain, moving slowly toward the mess hall. Suspicion followed every step. Inside, the scent was stronger, almost violent. Steam fogged the windows. The room buzzed with quiet movement. American soldiers in aprons flipping bacon, stirring vats of eggs, laying out trays. The prisoners stared. They had expected gruel, dry bread, maybe a handful of rice if someone felt generous. But this, the shimmer of grease, the richness of protein, this was madness. She took her tray in silence. A strip of bacon, scrambled eggs, a thick slice of bread, a metal cup of coffee so black it looked like oil. She didn't sit immediately. Her legs hesitated beneath her. What if this was a trick? Some test of loyalty? But the guards said nothing. One of them, the same man who had handed her water, sat nearby, sipping his own cup. He didn't watch her. He just drank, calm as a preacher. She sat. The first bite was almost too much. The salt hit her tongue like a slap. The fat melted across her teeth, and her throat convulsed, not in revulsion, but in desperate need. Her hand trembled. She set the fork down, breathing through her nose. Around her, the other women ate in cautious silence. Some chewed slowly, reverently. Others wept without shame. A few pushed food around their trays, unable to let go of fear. But she ate. Slowly at first, then steadily, then hungrily. The dog lay beneath, the table. She could feel his breath on her ankle, warm and constant. It grounded her, reminded her that this was real, and the silence, the true silence, was deafening. Not the silence of fear, like in the jungle hospitals, or the silence of starvation in retreat camps. This was something else. A structured quiet. No yelling, no beatings. Just the sound of chewing, of tin forks scraping tin trays, of coffee cups clinking gently against wood. It unsettled her more than noise ever had. By the time breakfast ended, her body felt both full and shaken. She had eaten more in 10 minutes than she had in days. Her stomach ached not from hunger, but from the shock of satisfaction. As she stepped outside, the sun had risen higher. The dog followed her, tail low, eyes half-lidded in contentment. Was this manipulation? A cruel trick, meant to break her with kindness? Or was it something far simpler, far more dangerous? An invitation to live. Later that day, after mess was cleaned and the sun had begun its slow arc toward the hills, a guard called her name. Not her number, her name, and motioned for her to step aside. In the shade of a supply hut, he handed her a folded wool blanket. No words, just the gesture. It was clean, heavy, and soft in her arms. She stared at it for a long moment, confused. She hadn't asked for it. No one else around her had received one, but the man simply tipped his cap and walked away. It was the first thing she'd been given since surrender that felt hers. Back in the barracks, she ran her fingers along the stitching. The wool was thick, coarse but whole, not torn, not stained. She hadn't had a blanket since Leyte, where the wounded lay on jungle floors, clutching wet rags and shivering against fevered nights. There she had learned to wrap bandages from old uniforms, to clean pus with water boiled over fire, to lie when a man asked if he would live. That world had felt endless, the heat, the hunger, the smell of rot that clung to her skin even after washing. But this folded wool in her hands, felt like a door cracked open. Not wide enough to step through, but enough to make her wonder what was on the other side. That night she didn't sleep immediately. The other women whispered softly around her, their voices like moth wings brushing against silence. The blanket rested over her body, heavy in a way that made her feel anchored instead of smothered. She closed her eyes. In her dream, she saw the dog again, not growling, not playful, but watching. Its eyes locked on hers, not with threat, but with some deeper comprehension, as if it saw past the khaki, the shame, the confusion. It stood beneath a tree of white blossoms that didn't exist anywhere in camp. When she reached for it, she woke. The dawn was still new, the sky washed in pale lavender. As she sat up, she noticed the shape just beyond the open door of the barracks. Curled beneath the stoop, head resting on crossed paws, was Buck, asleep, or pretending to be. She stood and walked quietly outside, stepping barefoot into the dirt. The dog lifted its head but didn't rise. It looked at her, blinked, then let out a soft chuff. Not a bark, not a warning, just sound. "Why me?" she whispered. The dog, naturally, did not answer. Later that morning, the American doctor called for her. A tall man with spectacles and a faint southern accent, he spoke gently, too quickly for her to understand most words. But his hands told the story. He changed her bandage, a wound from shrapnel weeks before, with a care that startled her. In Leyte, a superior had once slapped her across the face for wasting gauze on a dying man. Here, the doctor didn't flinch when she trembled. didn't rush. When she winced, he paused, then nodded. He unwrapped the old cloth, cleaned the skin, and placed a fresh white square over it with deliberate precision. She waited for some kind of lecture, a sneer, a reminder that she was the enemy. Instead, he gestured toward the wound and simply said, "Healing." She knew that word, had heard it in textbooks, in whispered prayers, in orders barked over screaming men, but never like this, never as permission. As she left the infirmary, she spotted Buck waiting outside, not tied, not summoned, just there, again, the third time now. There were dozens of women in the camp, dozens of hands, dozens of cots. Yet it was her door the dog lay beside, her path it walked, her scent it followed. It made no sense. But then, none of this did. Not the bacon, not the bandages, not the blanket, and certainly not the bark that never came. One morning, not long after roll call, a guard with a limp and sun-leathered skin walked past the assembled prisoners, turned on his heel, and returned holding something small and rattling. A paper packet. Seeds. He held it up between two fingers and looked at them like he was offering a dare. "Grow something," he said. Then he dropped the packet in the dust and walked away. The women stood motionless, unsure if this was some kind of test, some riddle they were meant to fail. Orders were supposed to come with threats. This came with silence. The nurse, though no one called her that anymore, stepped forward. She knelt in the dust and picked up the packet. Lettuce. She ran her thumb across the label, traced the foreign characters printed in faded ink. She didn't ask permission. She didn't know from whom she would ask it. Instead, she moved toward the far edge of the camp, near the fence, but not too close, where the soil was soft and dark beneath the surface. She knelt, dug her fingers into the dirt, and began to clear a patch. It wasn't much, just a small plot, the size of a blanket folded twice. The other women watched her, unsure. Some whispered, others drifted away. But she stayed. The seeds were small, dry, like bits of old rice. She planted them carefully, her hands moving from muscle memory more than belief. And as if summoned by this private ritual, Buck appeared. He walked to the edge of the patch, circled once, and lay down beside it. Not touching, just watching. At first she thought it was coincidence, but the next day, when she came to water the seeds with a tin cup borrowed from the mess hall, he was already there, waiting. His eyes followed her hands, his ears flicking at the sound of her footsteps. It became a routine. Every morning she came to the garden. Every morning the dog came too. There was something honest in the dirt. It did not demand answers. It didn't ask for blood or obedience. It simply responded to care. Back home, obedience had been sacred, a chain of command, a series of rituals so strict they smothered the soul. But kneeling in the soil, she felt none of that weight. Her fingertips, once calloused by bandages and blood, now cradled roots. The earth welcomed her not with duty, but with possibility. One afternoon, a shoot broke the surface, pale green, shy, fragile. She stared at it for a long time. Buck did too. She didn't smile, not quite, but something in her chest moved. The garden grew slowly. The patch remained small, but the routine gave her shape. Her body, once defined by wounds and withdrawal, now moved with purpose. Water, weed, wait. Other women began to kneel beside her, planting their own rows. Tomatoes, carrots. One tried wildflowers, though none took root. The guards said nothing. One of them, the cowboy with the limp, simply nodded when he passed, as if this was exactly what he'd hoped. One day, she caught her reflection in the infirmary window. Sun-browned skin, dirt under her, nails, a smear of dust on her cheek. She didn't recognize the face, but she didn't flinch from it either. The dog sat behind her in the glass, just as he had every day, silent and still. A mirror, a companion, a witness. What had begun as a test, or maybe a riddle, had become something else. Not survival, not resistance, but presence. And in that presence, something had begun to grow. She did not know the exact day it happened, only that the guards summoned the women after morning roll call and handed each of them a small bundle, a pencil, a single sheet of paper, and an envelope already stamped. The murmurs began immediately. Some women clutched the paper as if it might burst into flame. Others stared at it with open suspicion. Letters to home? Impossible. Unthinkable. A trap. She herself held the pencil like a fragile bone. It felt too light to carry everything inside her, too clean for the truths she had no words for. A guard spoke, slowly, gesturing with his hands. They could write. 1 page. Anything. The letters would be sent through proper channels. "Tell your families you are alive," he said. Alive. That word struck her harder than bacon, harder than bandages, harder than the dog rolling at her feet. Alive. She took her paper to the edge of the barracks, where a wooden crate sat beneath the shade of a crooked pine. Buck followed, as always. He circled twice, then dropped beside her with a grunt, pressing his warm weight against her leg. She settled onto the crate. The pencil hovered over the page, and then nothing. Minutes passed, maybe hours. The other women scratched quietly nearby, their faces tightened by concentration or fear or both. Some wrote quickly, as if words had been dammed inside them and now rushed out in a flood. Others froze entirely, like statues carved from dust. She tried to begin with a greeting. She lifted the pencil, lowered it, lifted it again. How did one speak to a mother who believed her daughter dead? How much truth could a page hold before it tore? The dog lifted his head and nudged her elbow gently. She exhaled. She wrote, "Mother, I am alive." Her hand trembled. The pencil tip broke. She sharpened it against the wood. Next line, "I am not beaten." That she hesitated over. Not beaten physically, yes, but there was another kind of breaking, the quiet dissolving of certainty, the shattering of lies she had grown up breathing. She did not write that part. She continued, "I am clean. They feed me." Her throat tightened. She could almost see her mother reading those words, disbelief tightening her jaw, fear twisting her breath, hope slipping through cracks she had long since sealed. The Empire had preached cruelty, had painted the enemy as devils, had promised torture, shame, annihilation. Yet here she was, fed, clothed, treated, and watched over by a dog who laid his head on her knee as if guarding her from the weight of her own words. Across the ocean, somewhere in Tokyo, she knew this letter would be intercepted. A censor would read these lines and frown. Perhaps he would dismiss her words as delusion, as weakness, as propaganda from the Americans. Perhaps he would worry. Perhaps he would burn it. But here, in this strange camp of silence and structure, she finished her letter. She wrote of the garden, but only a single sentence. "I planted something." She didn't specify what. Seeds, or hope, or the parts of herself she did not yet recognize. She folded the paper carefully, placed it in the envelope, and sealed it with hands that had once bound bullet wounds with bamboo strips. Buck watched each movement, his ears perked, his eyes steady. Not suspicious, not demanding, just present. It struck her then. The quiet watching was not from guards or fences or rifles. It came from memory, from the echo of what she had been told, from the ghosts of officers shouting that surrender was worse than death. from the faces of men she couldn't save, from the voice inside her insisting she had no right to peace. But the dog nudged her again, almost impatiently, as if urging her forward, as if reminding her that words placed on paper did not betray the past. They freed it. When she stood to deliver her letter to the guard collecting envelopes, Buck rose with her, matching her step for step. And for the first time, she felt the page inside that envelope was not a message to her mother. It was a message to herself. She stepped into the bathhouse expecting cold water, mildew, and humiliation. What she found instead was steam, rising, thick and real, the sound of pipes creaking with pressure, the scent of something sharp and clean, soap, real soap, not the slivers of ash-mixed powder they had scraped together in the jungle, but a thick bar, heavy in the hand, like stone smoothed by time. No one spoke. Each woman entered alone, a single towel, a few minutes. She undressed with shaking fingers, her uniform stiff with salt and dust, and stepped into the stall. The curtain fell behind her with a soft swish. Then the water came. Hot, not warm, hot. Her knees nearly buckled. It ran down her back like fire and forgiveness, cutting through weeks of sweat, fear, and dried blood. She scrubbed until her skin burned, until her nails were filled with the gray of memory and soil, until the soap slid through her fingers like a secret. And then she cried. She didn't know why. The tears mixed with the water, with the salt, with the sudden softness of heat. She wept for the men she couldn't save, for the nurse's cap buried in some foreign jungle, for the letter that might never reach her mother, for the fact that she was still alive when so many better people were not. She pressed her forehead against the tile and let the water rinse her hollow. When it was over, she dried slowly. The towel was thick, impossibly so. She wrapped it around her shoulders and sat on the bench outside the stall, steam still clinging to her hair. That night at supper, the dog was gone. Buck, who had followed her every morning to the garden, who had slept outside her door, who had leaned into her hand like he knew the war better than anyone, was nowhere. She scanned the yard, the path, the mess hall doorway. Nothing. A guard saw her searching. "Ran off into the hills," he said, chewing slowly. "Chases coyotes sometimes. He'll be back." But something in the man's voice was uncertain. The empty place at her side throbbed louder than she expected. She hadn't realized how much space the dog had taken up in her routine, in her sense of safety, even in her silence. Later, walking back to the barracks alone, the air colder now, she felt the absence like a bruise, small but real. The war had taught her how to lose large things, entire towns, lives, faith, futures, but it never taught her how to grieve the small ones. A bar of soap, a towel, a seedling, a dog. She wrapped herself in her blanket and lay staring at the ceiling. No distant barking, no soft chuff outside the door. And then sleep. In her dream, she stood knee-deep in a rice paddy, the water warm around her legs. Somewhere nearby, stew simmered over a fire, rich with salt and onions. A child laughed. Her hands were covered in soap suds, scrubbing a cloth in a basin that smelled of lavender. It was a life that had never been hers. Or maybe it had been, in some other version of the world, untouched by maps, and flags and orders shouted into radios. When she woke, the room was dark. The dog was still gone. But her skin, clean beneath the blanket, still carried the scent of soap. And for reasons she didn't understand, that was enough to keep breathing. The days passed slowly. Dust settled on the garden rows. The lettuce continued to push upward, green and defiant, as if unaware the one who once tended it most faithfully now sat listless by her cot. She still woke before the others, still moved through the motions. Wash, line up, eat, sweep. But something was missing in the corners of her world. The absence of the dog had become a kind of silence she couldn't escape. No bark, no paw prints in the dirt, no warm body curled at the stoop. She searched less now, pretending not to notice, but in the quiet moments her eyes still flicked to the gate, to the hills beyond it. The guards said little. The cowboy with the limp avoided her gaze. Once she thought he meant to speak, but he only tipped his hat and moved on. And then, one evening, as the wind carried the first hints of mountain chill through the narrow cracks in the barracks walls, there came a soft thump. Not loud, not urgent, just enough. She froze. Another thump, this time closer, at the door. She rose without a word, heart catching in her throat, and stepped barefoot across the wooden floor. She pulled the door open slowly. There he was, Buck, matted, dust-covered, and limping on one paw. His tail hung low but wagged weakly, a broken metronome of joy and apology. His chest rose and fell in shallow pants. A small gash marked his shoulder, dried blood crusted in his fur. But his eyes were unchanged, still watching her, still recognizing. She dropped to her knees in the doorway. The world narrowed to just them. Her hands cupped his face gently, thumbs brushing over dirt and dried blood. "You stupid, brave creature," she whispered, her voice cracking. "Why did you come back?" Buck leaned forward and pressed his forehead to her chest. Behind her, a few women had gathered. From the shadows near the fence, the cowboy guard watched. Slowly, reverently, he removed his hat and held it to his chest. No one said anything. No one needed to. In this moment, in the fading light, something broke and mended all at once. She was no longer a prisoner, no longer a uniform or a number. She was a woman on her knees, cradling a soul that had come back to her through dust and blood and silence. That night, Buck slept curled against her cot. The guards didn't stop it. No one asked questions. She cleaned his wound with water and a strip of linen. Her hands, once trained to bind men back together in jungle darkness, now moved with a softness she hadn't known she possessed. He winced once, then leaned into her touch. The moon cast pale light across the barracks floor. The other women slept. But she sat awake beside him, fingers resting on his back, feeling the rise and fall of his breath, the thrum of life beneath fur and scar. This was not a victory, not a grand redemption. It was something quieter, a return of trust, of a creature, of something human inside her that hadn't died after all. And the cowboy, the one who had first handed her seeds and said nothing else, nodded once when their eyes met the next morning, like he had seen everything and understood. If you're feeling this story, like it, and let us know where in the world you're watching from in the comments below. The news came not with explosions, but with a whisper, a bulletin pinned to a board, a sentence read aloud by a guard who didn't meet their eyes. Japan had surrendered. The war was over. There were no cheers, no relief, just silence. Some women wept, others stared at the dirt as if it might offer them answers. One collapsed where she stood, knees folding like paper. The nurse, though she still no longer called herself that, stood very still and watched the clouds move across the sky. The end of empire was not marked with parades, but with a list. Names, units, dates of return, repatriation. The word itself felt like an illusion, a trick of grammar. She had belonged to a nation that no longer believed in surrender, and now it had surrendered. She had survived something she could no longer name. The women packed slowly. Some refused to believe it. Others clung to the rhythm of routine. One more bed made, one more garden watered, one more bowl of rice cleaned spotless. She gathered her few possessions: the blanket, a folded paper flower given by one of the younger prisoners, a scrap of seed packet tucked inside her sleeve. Buck knew. From the moment the trucks arrived, he didn't bark, didn't chase, didn't whine. He simply watched. From the edge of the road, still limping slightly but stronger now, he stood with the same quiet certainty that had marked his return, as if this moment, too, had already been accepted. She walked past him slowly, her boots pressing prints into the dust. At the bed of the truck, she turned. Their eyes met. She did not call to him, did not cry. He didn't move. The air between them held everything unspoken. All the mornings in the garden, the letters written in silence, the wound he had returned with, the head pressed to her chest in the doorway. This dog, once a stranger, once a threat, had become a companion to her most unspoken hours, and now he was a chapter she would not carry with her. The engine rumbled, dust kicked into the air. The truck began to move. She kept her eyes on him for as long as she could, and he, in turn, did the same. Not a single bark, not a single step. Just that still, watching presence. The same that had followed her through every part of this strange captivity. When the curve in the road finally took him from view, she lowered her head. No one spoke. Later, when someone asked if she had left anything behind, she said no, but she had. Something soft, something wordless, something that didn't belong to empires or uniforms or history books, and maybe, just maybe, that was the first thing she had ever owned that was truly hers. The road home was long, the Pacific wide, but the space between a woman and a dog on a dusty road in Colorado, that space would remain untouched by time, a place no war could reach. But war has many ways of echoing. When she stepped off the repatriation ship and onto Japanese soil, nothing felt familiar. Not the wind, not the skyline, not even the silence that met them at the dock. It wasn't the silence of peace, but of vacancy, like someone had pressed pause on the soul of the country and forgotten to start it again. Her shoes touched home, but home didn't respond. The journey to her village took days, strung together by late trains, broken roads, and long stretches of walking beside strangers who all wore the same expression, hollow, alert, and full of questions they didn't dare ask aloud. When she finally reached the valley she once called home, she stood in the middle of a rice field grown wild with weeds. The house was gone. Not damaged, gone. Blackened beams stuck out like ribs from the earth, and the plum tree was nothing more than a twisted, charred silhouette. She said nothing. There was no one left to hear her anyway. She wandered the remains, looking for something, a spoon, a thread of fabric, the edge of her mother's calligraphy brush. But the fire had been thorough. In the following days she drifted from village to village. No real welcome awaited her. Japan was trying to forget its returning prisoners, especially the ones who came back looking strangely unbroken. Whispers followed her, like dry leaves skittering across temple courtyards, whispers of women who had returned from American camps with strange stories, women who looked clean, fed, who said things like, "They treated us kindly," or "There was hot water," or "We had dogs." People didn't know what to do with that. It clashed with everything they'd been told. She never joined those whispers, never spoke of her own camp, or the garden, or the cowboy who handed her seeds. But late one evening, with the wind slipping beneath the thin shoji walls of the temple where she slept, she opened her suitcase. Everything was there just as she had packed it. The wool blanket folded tight, the letter never mailed, the paper flower gifted in a moment of stillness, And then, underneath it all, something she hadn't placed there. The dog's collar. She froze. It was his. Buck's. Leather worn soft, dusted with red soil, the buckle still slightly bent from where it had caught on a fence post once. She had not taken it. She knew that. She had left him, watching her from the side of the road, tail still, eyes alive. She had walked away. But someone, somehow, had slipped this into her bag. Perhaps the cowboy. Perhaps someone else. Perhaps, she thought with a breathless ache, the dog himself. She lifted the collar in both hands and pressed it to her chest, holding it there like a prayer, or maybe a wound. Her breath hitched. Her eyes stayed dry. "I do not understand this war any more," she whispered. Not as despair, as truth. And maybe she never had. The world she returned to was made of ash and rumor. The war had ended, but there was no real peace. There were no medals waiting for women like her, no stories told at shrines. But in the quiet, in the places where language failed and memory lived, she carried something no one could strip from her. A different kind of survival. A different kind of grace. At night, when sleep took her, it brought back scents and textures foreign to her own land, the steam of soap, the crunch of gravel under American boots, the warmth of a dog curled against her side. And when she held the collar, she knew, whatever else had been taken, whatever else would be forgotten, that something in that camp had saved her. And maybe, in some impossible way, she had saved something too. If this story moved you, like, share, and tell us where you're watching from. We'd love to know.